I'm the Director of Research here at the Elling Eide Center. Before we get started, I just want to let you know about a couple of upcoming events and programs that we have here this summer. We're going to continue to have our Arboretum and Building Tour on Tuesdays throughout the summer, led by Norman Burr, who is sitting there in the back, our intrepid docent. On June 2nd, in collaboration with Project Pride SRQ, we are hosting Dr. Rebecca Duran of the University of Miami, who will give a talk entitled Dress as Political and Gendered Symbol, an account of pre-Tang and Tang women rulers. And finally, we are offering a limited lecture and discussion series entitled Coffee and Confucius, led by myself over 5 Wednesday mornings in June and July, that promises to be a highly caffeinated discussion of Chinese history and culture. On behalf of the staff of the Elling Eide Center, I want to welcome everyone who is here and everyone attending online to today's lecture by Dr. Richard Tan. Lynn. Professor Lynn's long career has touched on so many different aspects of Chinese literature and culture, it is difficult to do it justice in this brief introduction. He has held teaching and research positions in New Zealand, Australia, and the United States, and was most recently Professor of Chinese Thought and Literature at the University of Toronto until he retired from teaching in 2005. He has published more than 100 book chapters, essays, articles, and reviews on topics ranging from art and art history to Chinese poetry in nearly every period, Song Dynasty uses of the I Ching, concepts of self and identity in various works of literature, snuff bottle culture in China, and Chinese intellectuals living and writing in Japan. He is also a prodigious translator of some very, very difficult texts. My own introduction to Professor Lynn's scholarship was through his translations of the I Ching, or Classic Changes, and the Tao Te Ching, and the commentaries on both of those texts by Zhuangzi, the 3rd century scholar. This fall, Professor Lynn will publish a translation of Zhuangzi and Guoxiang's 4th century commentary on that text. Dr. Lynn's translation of these 3 important works are thus notable for highlighting the importance of Chinese commentarial tradition, an aspect of Chinese literary history that often goes unnoticed by readers outside of the field of Chinese studies. In today's talk, Western Interpretations of a Taoist Classic, the Reception of Zhuangzi in the West, Professor Lynn will discuss the reception of Zhuangzi in the Western world and the European encounter with South and East Asian religious traditions beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries. So please help me extend a warm welcome to Professor Lynn.
Wow, I don't know if I can live up to that. Talking about somebody else, obviously. Well, I've been working with this text for some 20-odd years, not continually. It was put aside, and when people ask me how long I've been working on it, it's rather embarrassing. I think it was 1995 I started. But there were even several years in there that I had to put it aside because of other things. Anyway, we're having this recorded, so it'll be available somehow afterwards. And also this is a PowerPoint presentation, and I've already put this up on the ResearchGate, my website. So if anybody wants to look at some of the text that's in the slides, that might be a useful thing to do later. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me later when it comes to you, you can always send me an email at my utoronto.ca address. That gives you the illusion that I live in Toronto. I don't. I live on the west coast of British Columbia, off 37 miles due west of the Vancouver International Airport. It's one of the group of islands called the Gulf Islands in Canada. They're the San Juan Islands in the state of Washington. It's the same sort of archipelago that stretches up above the US border. We're about 100 miles north of the border where we are. I'm an American originally. I moved to Canada to teach in the 90s, and I'm now a citizen of both countries, which thanks to the US Supreme Court back in the 80s is legal. It wasn't before that. Anyway, here we are. And I'm talking about the Zhuangzi. First of all, we need to know what the Zhuangzi is. This will probably be old stuff for those of you who know something about the history of Chinese literature. I've got a brief synopsis of what it is. It's a collection of parables, aphorisms, short little essays, anecdotes, and so allegories and so forth. it's a rather big book. It's I've just done a new translation with the complete commentary of Guoxiang, who lived between 265 and 312. It's the first complete philosophical interpretive commentary on the Zhuangzi that was immensely influential throughout the Chinese tradition. But the new book is now, it's going to be 750 some pages long. And that's interesting for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons why it wasn't really paid much attention to in the first pattern of, or the first experience of Europeans encountering early Chinese texts. Well, it's about the Tao. And just briefly, the Tao is the great prime pattern or matrix of principles. It's sort of like a program that runs everything. All the properties and characteristics of everything animate and inanimate in the universe, including human beings. And the Taoist classics over and over again tell us that happiness and goodness is had by us if we're in tune with this program, this natural program. And those of us who try to overreach our natural endowments and the way the program has been kind of inherently built into us, that's where all the trouble starts. And the text more or less deals with how to recover this pristine, original, perfect, spontaneous relationship with nature. And it goes on and on and on in various ways, saying, attacking the problem from various angles and offering various solutions. Now, for a text like this, along with other early Chinese texts, to make its way into European consciousness, the Western world, there had to be an accommodation of some kind, an opening, perhaps even a breakdown of a rigid worldview that thought only in terms of the Judeo-Christian, and we can include Islam in that too. This tradition that we inherited from the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, and so forth. And I'm including Islam in this matrix because it was well known all throughout the European Middle Ages and was considered, though a competitor, it wasn't considered absolutely alien the way that everything else was until roughly the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, the first group of people to take Chinese intellectual thought seriously were the Jesuit missionaries who showed up in China at the end of the 16th and then throughout the 17th centuries. And most of these in China were of the Jesuit order. They also, Christian missionaries also went to Japan, but most of those were Franciscan. And this is important too for this period because there was a great rivalry between the Franciscans and the Jesuits at this time. And actually the Franciscans went out finally, but that's another story entirely. I don't know if we'll be able to get into that very far. Now, the reception of Confucian thought, the Confucian Analects, and the other Confucian classics, including the Classic of Changes, that was important. There was the reception of the Taoist thoughts, all the basic foundational texts of the Taoist tradition, the Tao Te Ching, the Classic of Change, or the Classic of Changes is claimed by both the Taoists and the Confucians. So it's sort of in both camps. And then we get interest in reading the Chinese texts in a figurative way. And the figurist interpretation is something borrowed from exegesis of the Old Testament. That is, that the New Testament, the story of Jesus and everything connected with Jesus, is prefigured or figured in the Old Testament. This was a way of interpreting the Old Testament by theologians in the West from the late medieval period on into the Renaissance and so forth. And this whole notion was taken over, in theory, by these Jesuits who approached Chinese texts in the same way. They found in these ancient Chinese texts, they thought they found, whether it was there or not, wasn't, that these texts, being virtuous pagans, they would prefigure the New Testament and the truths of the West, of the Western tradition. And the texts, the two texts that especially interested the Jesuits were the Classic of Changes, and this is the first translation of it, done by Noailles, Esley, the Society of Jesus, and it was never published, but the manuscript, the original manuscript, actually still exists, and it's held in the British Library. And the other text, well, here is the man himself, here in the middle, and it was never published. The I Ching when it came out, but it was translated later by this German scholar in the 19th century. Now, back to figurism. Figurism was an intellectual movement of Jesuit missionaries which viewed early Chinese philosophical texts as prophetic books prefiguring Christian doctrine. Now, the drawings of the text I'm going to be talking about today never seems to have been viewed in this way. Its immense size compared to the Tao Te Ching in particular. It's probably 10 times as long. That's one reason. It discouraged early explorers. And its position in the Taoist tradition was certainly important. It was a marginal work as far as mainstream Confucian-based orthodoxy was concerned. And early translators and students of Chinese culture back then really let themselves be allowed, they allowed themselves to be led by their Chinese counterparts, who were Confucian-based scholar, gentry, officials. And they identified with them very strongly and picked up, along with all the truths from them, they also picked up all their prejudices. And the Confucian-based Orthodox establishment was rather hostile to the Taoist tradition. So that's another reason it's left out. And then the text itself is full of irony and anti-establishment sentiment. It had an ambivalent place in the tradition as a whole, anyway. And finally, it seemed to figurist interpretations that the Zhuangzi lacked religious significance, unlike the Laozi or Tao Te Ching, which in their view was rich in such meaning. Now, they're rather jealous of Uhr's top. The Swiss government pays him a lot of money just to sit around and write books. What a life. Anyway, he has written several books about the reception of by Europeans of Chinese thought and Buddhism in particular. His book on Buddhism is a rather catchy title. It's called The Empire of Emptiness. Anyway, this is, even in the 1820s, this is something that Dr. App has written. And I believe that the world is only a few thousand years old, and the people's all can be traced back to Mozart. Anyway, see, until the 19th century, there was the notion that everything had to fit into the European frame of reference to make any sense. Therefore, if the Chinese tradition had something significant to say, it somehow had to be significant in European terms rather than in its own terms. That's what I was getting at by making a synopsis of this book. The picture is rather interesting. It's the customs of American savages, I mean, the native people of North America, compared to the customs from the first times, in other words, the Garden of Eden, before mankind fell. Anyway, that's what the picture is about. Now, let me back up. He says, even in the 1820s, Europeans believed, well, not all Europeans, not in the same way. And he was trained through lycée, the high school era, and into his early adulthood by the Capuchin monks, friars of the Franciscan order in schools in Switzerland. So he really had a firm dose of Orthodox Christianity as a background. And so he is looking at the confrontation with non-European traditions from that perspective. However, there is another perspective, and that's sort of an underground, marginal perspective that can be traced back all the way to the Gnostics of the Messianic era from the time of Jesus himself. And through the medieval mystics, Meister Eckhart and people like that. And Nicholas of Cusa is an interesting figure. His place near Trier in the Mosel Valley, it's upriver from Trier, about less than an hour drive, where we visited some years ago. There's his original place there. He was an archbishop and a contender for the papacy at one point. And he had rather heretical views, but given his strong position in the church, he got away with it. I doubt if he would have if he was anybody else. And in the visitor's book, there at the entrance of this little museum dedicated to him, are a lot of people from China. This is sort of a pilgrimage place. And there are things written in Chinese that say, oh, it's just like the Tao Te Ching, it's just like Lao Tzu. And his famous work is a tract that he wrote on the doctrine of ignorance, that is, you have to empty yourself and let God come in. And this is a tricky thing because it's a notion, and this is, we're getting into the era of the Protestant Reformation, where every man can be his own priest. That's dangerous stuff, right? The notion that divinity can be something discovered or innate, rather than that you can only beg for from a transcendent other. Now, this sort of shift in emphasis to the immanence rather than transcendence is something that lay at the bottom of the interest in such texts as the Zhuangzi. And in Europe, it took the form of a movement called Quietism, and there are some of the major figures involved in it. Miguel de Molinas and Marie Bouvier de Montquillon and Francois Fénelon, among others. So we have to move on. Here's just pictures. And she was declared a heretic because it was too tricky. A short and very easy method of prayer that all may practice effortlessly. And she was declared heretical because instead of meditating on transcendent truths, it was sort of contemplation or self-cultivation that somehow within oneself can find the aspects of divinity. And pictures of people involved. And most interesting is Chevalier Ramsay, a Scottish-born writer who was converted to Roman Catholicism. He was a baronet in a Jacobite peerage, but then he became a ardent Roman Catholic and associated with Bonnie Prince Charlie and the whole movement that came to naught, of course. Now, he wrote many political theological treatises, but he was most famous for this book. This is an English translation of originally a French work, and it was translated also into Dutch, German, published mostly in Holland during this period. And the Travels of Cyrus. Cyrus is the ancient Persian king, the first great unifier of the Persian Empire in the 7th century BC. This empire was enormous from the Mediterranean to the Indus, And Cyrus was famous for, among other things, universal tolerance. All the different people were treated equally in his empire, and all the religions. So, and Ramsay wrote this imaginary journey where he goes throughout his realm, visiting everywhere. And he then has a chance in these visits and interchanges with the local priests and so forth, and all the different religions, showing that truth can come from almost anywhere, and it's all equally possibly true, and so forth. So it's a very open-minded kind of a thing. And of course, he even sort of mixes his own voice in with that of the invented character Cyrus, the ancient Persian king, and thinks about China. Cyrus didn't go to China, and Ramsay didn't either, but he certainly went in imagination. And he starts to mention, among other thinkers, he actually mentions where the blue arrows are, works that are of interest to us, including the Zhuangzi, which he does mention. Now, he quotes, he's saying he relies on conversations and information from a gentleman of superior genius. However, this gentleman of superior genius is one of the Jesuits who interpret Chinese texts figuratively. And very interesting, Ramsay does not himself. He interprets them literally to mean what they say. So he has emancipated, he is using the figurist sort of intermediaries to get at these texts, but then rejects this reading and goes his own way. Now, this gentleman of superior genius was Francois Fouquet, who was active in the Chinese missions. He wrote various things. And what is fascinating is that all this stuff is available for free on the internet through archive.org. The Jesuits did a correspondence with their compatriots back in Europe. There was an enormous correspondence going back and forth, and all of this was eventually published in various journals, and all these journals are available there at archive.org. Now, I live on this island, and I have a fairly large personal library myself, not as big as what's over here, about a third of that size. But I've been able to do some amazing work just thanks to the internet. I mean, this has transformed scholars' way we do things completely compared to what things were like when I first started out below these many years ago. Anyway, John Whitehill, now deceased, he was professor at Georgetown University in Washington. He wrote the best book in English about Fouquet. There he is. There's Professor Whitehill, who's also a Jesuit, of course. And then these ideas got popularized through general works like this, Dual's work. It went through, I don't know how many printings and how many languages, and influenced people up in, from Europe to North America. And these works are available all in English, and again, for free for the downloading at archive.org. Now, Zhuangzi didn't get into European consciousness entirely through this philosophical route. They came primarily via this man, Terre d'Entrecote. He was a French Jesuit priest. He's best known in the West for transmitting the Chinese technique of manufacturing hard-faced porcelain. Well, that's a nice way of saying he stole it. The French porcelain industry got secrets from Qingdao through Entrepot. He went there, he watched, he wrote, and then the influence. This is how he's mostly known. And this is one of those journals that's available And it mentions a story. He must have had a sense of humor because there is a very ironic story. There's a story of Master Zhuang or Zhuangzi, who it's a Ming Dynasty short story in fiction. It's a story meant to entertain. It's not a philosophical work, whatever. But Anthropologue was quite fascinated by it. He translated it and sent it back to Europe, where it eventually spread to be known through all the languages of Europe, and even made its way into early 19th century the United States. And the story briefly goes like this. Master Zhuang is walking in the hills, and he happens to be passed by a cemetery. And there is a young widow with a fan over a newly dug grave, fanning the earth to dry it. And he asks her about it. And she says, I promised my husband I would not have another man until the earth above his grave was dry. So he goes home and he tells his own wife this, and she said, oh, that's terrible. I'd never do that. She was he must be an awful woman. Well, then we get into some crazy stuff. He transforms himself into, first of all, he transforms himself into a corpse. So he dies. So the body is placed in a shed behind the farmhouse. And while before he's even buried, he again transforms himself into a young, good-looking young man, scholar, on his way to take the imperial examinations. He stops by, and the wife and he, of course, get together, and they have an affair. And but he's already he's involved, of course. He's manipulating the whole situation. And then he reveals himself. She is utterly mortified and hangs herself, committing suicide. And at that point, he burns the shed down and smashes up the cooking pots and so forth. And then goes off seeking him, the truth, the Tao in the mountains, and that's the last we hear of him. Well, this is very much like a story in the Satyricon. This, by the way, is where you can find it. There's a good translation in this collection. It's Zhuangzhou. Zhuangzhou is his actual personal name. Drums on a bowl and sings his great Tao. And there's a scholar in Taiwan, Professor Xu, who has written the definitive work that relates everything, a comparative relationship in a comparative literary study relating the Chinese text with the Satyricon story, and then its production in Europe on the stage. It became very, very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. And Voltaire did one version of it, only he turned the Chinese story into a Persian story for some reason. Anyway, but that's that. Voltaire is a young man, Voltaire is an old man. And there it is, where it actually relates the two stories together. They're actually in the same volume. Again, this is available on archive.org. And here's the Chinese story, the French version. Mm-hmm. And Oliver Goldsmith did a version of it published in the Citizens of the World. And Sir Francis, John Francis Davis, the second governor of Hong Kong, did a big history of China, and he included a version of it there. The Gentleman's Magazine. This is a peculiar person who signed himself Sylvanus. His actual name was Edward K. He did one. And this is an American. He was a Harvard man, and apparently a complete pain in the ass. Anyway, he did Dealings with the Dead. He included the story there. And now we come to actual translations of the Zhuangzi. The first one was by Balfour, an odd man. It's awful. It's not worth reading except to see how bad translations can be. He was taken to task by, here it is actually, the actual text. This is early 1880s. And the first criticism was by Herbert Giles. If you've always wondered about how Chinese names, terms are transliterated, you know, there was the Wade-Giles system. All right, this is Herbert Giles and Thomas Wade. Thomas Wade was not a scholar as such. He worked for Her Majesty's Customs of China. The Chinese decided that they could probably get more money if the British ran their customs than if they ran it themselves, which is an echo today. The Chinese organic fruit and vegetable industry is monitored by a Canadian firm. There's a story there, a moral you can draw on yourself. Anyway, Herbert Giles did a review of this, and he says, only one previous attempt has been made to place Zhuangzi in the hands of English readers. In that case, the knowledge of the Chinese language possessed by the translator was altogether too elementary to justify such an attempt. And then he points out one particularly bad translation. Now, Balfour came back with an interesting rejoinder. He was saying that sometimes an amateur archer can sometimes hit the target when masters of archery cannot. Well, this is like, you know, like a loose cannon can have a full shot too, if it drills around the wall, right? Or monkeys can write and play Shakespeare. If you give them enough time and maybe a multi-universe to do it. Okay, and I translated this myself, and I just show how really bad the translation is. It's completely off the wall. And I include this just briefly as for humor's sake. This scholar, Van Gabelentz, did a grammar of classical Chinese, but he based it all on the Zhuangzi. This is like somebody writing a grammar of English based on Joyce's Ulysses. It's bizarre. Anyway, there it is. There it is. Now, the first significant translation was done by Herbert Giles. Most of his career was a consular official in the British consular service in Taiwan, first in Danshui. The consulate building there at the north end of Taiwan still exists. I don't know what they do with it now. When I lived there, it was still a British consulate. Then he was in Ningbo and in Shanghai, among other places. But eventually he became the first professor of Chinese studies at Cambridge University. This book greatly influenced Oscar Wilde, who wrote a review of it in 1890 in The Speaker. It's a bit more about Giles. Many of the important critical essays of Wilde are included in this volume. But the original, this again is available at archive.org. The original work itself. And as you might expect, Oscar Wilde was open-minded, ready to find fault with his own European tradition. And he had a great deal of good to say about it. And he relates it to the European mystical tradition that sort of runs on the margin, but very strongly throughout the European consciousness from the Middle Ages on. But then he goes on, of course, to castigate the materialistic stuffy, stodgy middle class, which he hated. And he regarded Zhuangzi as more than a metaphysician and luminous. He sought to destroy society as we know it and as the middle class is done. There's nothing in the sentimentalist in him. He pities the rich more than the poor, and so forth. He finds a great deal of the ironic statements in Zhuangzi to be very sympathetic. And then he sums it all up in this one last sentence. While as for a thoroughly sympathetic man he is in the eyes of Zhuangzi, simply a man who is always trying to be someone else. And this is, you shouldn't do this. This is the heart of the problem. Where people lose the Tao. They try to be something that they are not. He's always simply a man who's trying to be someone else, and so this is the only possible excuse for his own existence. And this was taken up by this interesting man, Aubrey Moore. He was a priest in the Anglican Church of England. There's an Anglican Church of Canada, an Anglican Church of Australia, an Anglican Church of New Zealand, and an Episcopal Church in the United States. So we don't have a Church of England in the United States. But anyway, he was at Magdalen College and a tutor at Keble College at Oxford, and he was quite interested in natural science and a great apologist for Darwin and trying to to stop this absolute dichotomy between science and religion that was the prominent way of looking at things in those days. And he wrote a series of essays, and he wrote this. But I have to point out parallelisms of thought and reasoning between East and West. It may stimulate those who are really competent to understand both, and to tell us where the parallelism is real, where it's apparent. It's very open-minded. It's really a wonderful statement. I really appreciate the things he said. And this is again in the PowerPoint presentation, which is available at my website. There at the beginning of the first slide. And this is his preface to the Zhuangzi itself. That's in Giles' work. Now, the other early translation is by his rival, I suppose you could say. This is James Lake. James Lake translated all the Confucian classics. He hated the I Ching. He thought it was just a waste of time, but because it was one of the classics, he did it anyway. He was a bishop in Hong Kong, and then a great translator. This is a family portrait. The Chinese man here on the far side is Wang Tao. Wang Tao is his collaborator in his translations, the Chinese classics. That's still in print, I think. Oxford keeps bringing out another edition of it. Wang Tao was also the founder and sort of father of modern Chinese journalism in China. He was a target of the Qing dynasty secret police. He was a fugitive. He eventually wound up, after hiding in Shanghai for a while, came to Hong Kong, and there he met Lei and Ms. Lei here. A great correspondence went on, which is all owned by the New York Public Library. All written in classical Chinese. Giles, or rather, Lei to Wang Tao and Wang Tao. It's an interesting set of archival material. And Lei brought out his version in 1891 in this series in the Sacred Books of the East, which were edited by Max Mueller. There's Max. And again, Max was associated with Oxford, Clarendon Press, and where all these things were originally published. And they were very different. Giles was agnostic, secular, skeptical about the authenticity of ancient Chinese texts. He thought the Lao Tzu was mostly a forgery of post-Han times. And he, of course, participated with Thomas Wade in creating the transliteration system, which was really quite prominent until it was replaced by the Chinese pinyin system in the 1980s. And he was a Christian missionary, religious believer, a stout defender of the integrity of ancient Chinese texts. And he was the first professor of Chinese at Oxford. He found Giles' translation painful. But then he said, the Zhuangzi is the hardest nut to crack in all translation. I think it's probably right. And this is the first edition of 1891. Then Franois translated a part of it in the 1930s. It's supposed to be, in terms of the interpretation of Guoxiang, the book I did, or I've just finished. However, I discovered that he only puts down Guoxiang's commentary when he agrees with it. Otherwise, he ignores it. Lynn, the famous translator, and during the Second World War period, who did much to generate sympathy for the Republic of China. Here he is at the bottom. You know who the woman is? It's Pearl Buck. The 1939 Nobel Prize winner in literature. And probably the most widely read and known version is by Bertrand Watson, also published by Columbia University Press. His translations of stuff, I mean, it's just voluminous. I remember Helmut Wilhelm, one of my teachers, saying of him, he's the court translator of Columbia University. And he just passed away just 5 years ago, after a marvelous career. And this is his version. He called it Complete Works of Zhuangzi, just to give it a different title, I suppose. Then Angus Graham, A.C. Graham, a rather eccentric fellow, brilliant, but he took all kinds of liberties with the text. He tried to rearrange it how he thought it should be arranged, and this made a lot of people very unhappy, especially in China, claiming that parts of it were later and earlier, and that sort of thing. And Victor Mayer, here's Victor. His translation version is Wandering on the Way. It's pretty good. However, both Watson and Mayer used Japanese translations and annotated versions very carefully. And both those versions based on Japanese commentators, those Japanese commentators tended to follow a Song dynasty, a late 12th, early 13th century commentator named Lynn, who translated, or who wrote a commentary on the Zhuangzi in the vernacular of this day, which is easier to read. But it's a version that interprets it largely in Neo-Confucian terms, which in turn is very much influenced by Buddhist thought. So it's very, very different than the Guoxiang commentary that I myself used. I particularly like Thomas Merton's excerpts. Merton didn't know Chinese, but he knew just about every European language well to read. And he pieced together a series of excerpts from the Zhuangzi, published by the Way of Zhuangzi. There he is. From Kentucky. He was the Garden of Gethsemane in Kentucky until he died rather tragically at a ecumenical conference in Bangkok. He touched a electric fan that was 240 volts, and he died instantly at the age of 53, which was really, really too bad. He was a brilliant. Anyway, I've been a Christian monk for 25 years, and he was sympathized with Zhuangzi as a solitary and recluse. There's a monastic outlook that's common, across cultures. And instead of devoting their life to arbitrary presuppositions and social conventions and temporal satisfaction, all mirage is onto the notion. Whatever may be the value of life in the world, there's always men who have preferred thought, and he identifies. And then I like this text. This book is not intended to prove anything or convince anyone of anything, but he doesn't want to hear about it. In other words, it's not an apologetic subtlety or any work of Jesuitical sleight of hand. Christian rabbits will suddenly appear by magic out of the box. I simply like Zhuangzi because he is what he is, and I feel no need to just disliking to myself. Anyway, I did, the Zhuangzi is of three works. I call the Sunshine, the three arcane classics. They are I Ching, the Tao Te Ching, and the Zhuangzi. I've done them all now. This was the first one. And these coins, there's ways of doing the I Ching with milfoil, with sticks, and with coins. And these are coins that I bought in when I was a grad student in Kyoto, way back in the last century, at the Great Temple. Every month there's a Great Temple Bazaar fair, and I bought them there. And they appeared on the first, the Columbia University Press won a prize with this design, by the way, back then. And this is the one that you saw here. I've gotten these, this piece of calligraphy, it's Wu Wei, avoid conscious effort. Everything should be spontaneous rather than thought out. And this piece of calligraphy, and this new one, this is the book. Now there's a paper shortage of all things. The book is finished. It was supposed to go in production and be available last month, but there's not enough paper to print it, so it's not going to appear until September. And this piece of calligraphy also, by a different calligrapher, but they both are owned by Hugh Moss, a friend of mine who's an art dealer. And Hugh actually commissioned this for me, and it appears on the cover. And this is that famous statement, where can I find someone who will forget words so I have a word, can I have a word with him? In other words, the real truth is beyond words. If you get stuck in words, it's the parable of the fish in the rabbit snare, fish trapped in rabbit snare. Once you get the fish, you can forget the fish. Once you get the rabbit, you can forget the snare. Once you forget words, you can forget the meaning. That's the parable. And I think I've done it in time.
Ask a question, please just raise your hand. If you need to go, please feel free to do so. You can just quietly go toward the exit. And if you have any questions that you would like to ask either myself or Mr. Mitchell, then you can please come in the chat with us as well. We have some time for questions if anyone has.
So what drove you to undertake this arduous task?
We have to go back to the evening. I was without a job, between jobs. I resigned from one job too many. What is it, the parable of the wing walker in the old days, the acrobats that went up and walked on wings of airplane? You don't let go of one strut until you grab another. Well, I did, and I was without a job. And I needed to make money at doing anything. And a editor of, Bonnie Crown is her name. She ran an Asia house in New York City and was an editor, and she was an agent, a literary agent, and she approached me saying, we need a new I Ching, and you're the one to do it. And I thought she was crazy, because I had never worked in these things before. But that's how I got into that. And once I got into that, I got into Lao Tzu, and then Lao Tzu into the Zhuangzi. They hang together. That's how I got it. No good reason. And if you want to know why I got into Chinese studies, I even have worse reasons for that.
Yeah.
That's too complicated.
Oh,
Professor, we have a question from online that somebody asked, they would be curious to ask if Leibniz had any role in European reception of the Zhuangzi. This person says, my sense is that he was not aware of it, but he would love to know if he was mistaken.
Leibniz was very interested in the I Ching. That's where he got binary mathematics from.
Right.
From the hexagrams. But I don't think he was particularly or at all interested in Zhuangzi, though he likely knew about it because he was in correspondence and knew many of these Jesuits either personally or through correspondence. So I guess that he knew about it, but it didn't matter that much to him because there wasn't probably anything of significance in it for him from his point of view then. Oh,
Could you share with us an illustration of your work and elucidate it?
an illustration? Well, all right, let's go to that slide where where are we?
Translation.
Yeah. Yeah.
There.
All right, it's from the miscellaneous chapters. It's chapter 23. And Balfour, as Giles points out, translates a one-legged man disregards ornament, his exterior not being open to commendation, which I'm not even sure what it means. Sentence. Anyway, this is the actual text from the Gongsan, the one-legged abandons adornment, for he has placed praise and blame beyond him. Now that's the Zhuangzi. And the commentary by Guoxiang says, adornment is the means to decorate one's looks, since the appearance of one whose foot has been cut off is already ruined by suffering such loss. He no longer is concerned with whether he looks good or not. And this is why he abandons it and has nothing more to do with it, which is quite clear. If your looks are already that ruined, what do you care about? And of course, losing a foot is a criminal punishment. All sorts of nasty things can happen. Bad people are maybe not so bad people. That's kind of the work I do. It's close reading of texts and reading commentaries within the tradition to, in effect, try. I was interviewed recently by the Chinese Journal of Comparative Literature, and I characterized myself as an old-fashioned scholar, a Chinese scholar who has, and I look at things as much as I can from a Chinese traditional point of view. I was an intrinsically sort of inferior look rather than trying to impose something from the outside.
So understanding the culture is important as much as understanding the language.
My teacher, James Chevalier, who taught at Stanford and before that Chicago and before that England, and so forth, Hong Kong, Hawaii, East West North. Anyway, Professor Liu said to be really a good translator, it's not just being bilingual, you have to be bicultural. And he really wanted, he actually learned Italian just because he loved opera. Tried Italian opera, so he learned Italian. Quite amazing. But many Chinese scholars of that era, another friend, Professor Hebing Di at the University of Chicago, he was a great expert in language China. And he did that for, I think, for the same reason. And you have a question?
Yes, I imagine that your work progressing through, as you described, these three main documents, resulted in some sort of re-understanding as you were doing the later ones. It changed your understanding of the earlier ones.
Not so much that I want to go back and redo them.
No. I'm wondering if you could share any important insights you might have gained
I see.
in the later work on your.
Well, I've been at this a long time, and sure, it's hard to begin. I certainly am changed. I mean, I'm almost 82 now, and I started all this stuff a few days before my 21st birthday. And I've gone through an awful lot, as anybody would during all those years. And I've gotten better at this. I think I'm better at it what I do now than I ever have been, which is fortunate. And it's a great way to stave off dementia, I'll tell you. I don't have to do Sudoku puzzle, the multiplication kit. This stuff is really demanding. It certainly helped to develop a very wide open possibility. I was brought up as a Roman Catholic, and I'm not a committed to any. And I don't know what but I'm certainly open to almost anything. And you know, hope for the best. There's a vague feeling that I'm certainly ecumenical, and I really hesitate to say I'm a firm Christian of one kind or another, simply because I'm not inclined to any kind of sectarianism. I think I'm very open-minded in that respect, and I think that's a byproduct of my training and interest in Chinese culture. That's about what I wanted to know. Sort of vague and it's out of all I can come up with at the moment. Yes.
Completely different, but have you ever read Chinese translations of like the Bible and how their interpretation is compared to our interpretations of some of their writings?
Oh, they're pretty good.
Really?
Pretty good. Yeah. As time goes on, the earlier ones are a bit odd, but then it's just, again, it's a question of understanding the background and cultural significance and that sort of thing. Yeah, the trivial kind of things, the mistranslations are kind of even jokes. You see this in Japan as well. That's just because people don't bother. Well, you can't go, Google Translate doesn't do it. You plug classical Chinese text in the Google Translator. You get rubbish. Junk. Modern Chinese, not bad.
Okay. Thank you.
I remember when I was in Shanghai and my brother lived there for a number of years with his family. They were learning to speak Mandarin. And my brother refused to try. He was like, because he said, if I don't put the accent on the right part, he goes, I'm telling my kids their mother's a horse.
Oh.
He said I do it wrong all the time.
That's sort of an exaggeration, but I see what he's getting at.
Yeah.
If you don't speak the correct tones,
Right.
the result tends to be something like in English, putting emphasis on the wrong syllable. But it's still intelligible from the context.
Yeah.
And if you speak fast enough, they don't notice anyway.
He had a terrible time. Kids did.
It's interesting, the Chinese didn't discover that they had tonal language until Buddhism came.
Yeah.
And Sanskrit text. And they realized, gee, we have a tonal language. They didn't even realize it. That was the 5th century, 8. Want to say something? Ian?
We know that there's revival of interest in Confucianism in contemporary time.
Yeah.
What about
Oh, yeah.
Franois?
Well, it's all part of the Communist Party are the stewards of the heritage. Okay, it's an important political assertion. Now, and Taoism is native Chinese. Buddhism is. So this native Chinese religion is, our thing. So, and that's why it's promoted, and subsidized, and temples and rebuilt and so forth. And it's also very popular outside of China, in Taiwan, and Singapore, the Chinese world, the speaking world in general.
Even though the import of Islam is so hostile to
Well,
material.
there's an issue involved between Daojia and Daojiao, Taoist religion and Taoist philosophy. And there used to be a very clear dichotomy that the philosophy of the foundational text is one thing that's quite respectable, and the religion with all its superstitions is something else. And but we're discovering that there's quite a lot of interrelations among the two, and this has come to light in the last 40, 50 years in particular. That this is a false dichotomy, and that one can find a great deal of the elements of each of the other. However, in the Guoxiang commentary, I see no evidence of Taoist religion, elements of alchemy, elixirs of immortality, all that stuff. None. There's none of that in the Zhuangzi. Now, you can read a lot of that into the Lao Tzu. That's why the Lao Tzu is the cardinal, essential, prime work in the Taoist religion, and the Zhuangzi isn't.
Just an online question about asking you in terms of like the sort of like the three main religions of China, Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism. Why are you particularly interested in Taoism, and did you have any kind of special encounter with it that prompted you to be interested in it?
No, I'm a scholar, for heaven's sakes. I just got interested in it because of its textual interest, the intellectual interest, the challenge of translating it, because it's never been done. No one has ever translated the entire commentary with the text of the original. And that is to integrate the text with the commentary so that each illuminates the other. You can't simply tack on Guoxiang's commentary to, say, Victor Mayer's or Burton Watson's translations. So I was interested in it, not so much because of any commitment to I do a lot of other things too. Until I got involved with these texts back in the 90s, up to then, my primary interest was Chinese literary theory and poetics. And everything hangs together. All these relationships, pay off if you live long enough. People are morals, more or less. And that's what I'm doing now. Yes.
And I imagine that if it didn't hang together, you knew that you didn't get it right. With it, is that
That's quite presumptive, yes. Yeah.
And it was only until you read all that other stuff that you could judge.
It takes a long time to do this, because I started learning Chinese at Yale one summer, back when Yale still ran the Institute of Far Eastern Languages that the Air Force funded. And in the summer, they opened it up to anybody who wanted to do various languages. And I started Chinese. I was at Princeton then, and that was between my junior and senior years. And it's been a long time since then, and I've been working at it ever since and gotten better at it over the years. And I've discovered the connections. which I think helps a great deal. And now I'm doing a book on a late 19th century Chinese poet who went to Japan. His name was Zhuangzi, and he was the secretary, the third in rank in the first Chinese imperial legation that went anywhere in the world. The first was to Tokyo, and it was largely in response to the crisis over Korea, the sovereignty over Korea, and Taiwan and the Ryukyu Islands. The Chinese lost all of that, of course, but the embassy went to Tokyo in 1877, and Wang Zongxian wrote a lot of poems, 214 in 2 different editions, about what he encountered, along with prose essays about the subjects involved, everything from steam locomotives in the new railway system to why Japanese still sit on the floor. We ancient Chinese did, but we got up off the floor, you know, in the 5th century roughly, but the Japanese never did, and why, that sort of thing. And I'm finding all sorts of help from even texts like this. You know, reading these late 19th century poems and prose passages from this diplomat poet.
This is one question of, when were the various 3 major texts written? Do they have dates?
There's great arguments over that because they're not all written at the same time. Now, Guoxiang thought that Zhuangzhou, Master Zhuang, wrote all of them, or at least his sayings are recorded systematically, and they are all said by what was said is said all by the same person. That's not true. There's layers in the text, and it probably was written from probably the 6th century to the 3rd century BC, roughly, with the first coherent text and a much larger text. There are 53 chapters, and he edited down to 33 in the 4th century, early 4th century. But that earlier, bigger version is lost. No, there's no. As I've been working on this over 20 years, I've kept, my nightmare is they're going to dig up some tomb, and there it is. Scholars of early China all have this nightmare that you work on something for a lifetime, and all of a sudden it's all wiped out because of some discovery. Well, that has to happen. At least that doesn't happen until September. So, and the other texts again are equally troublesome.
This is a good time to bring up a question from online. Someone asked if your translation of Zhuangzi will include all 30 chapters.
Yes, the whole thing. Yep, you get no discount. It will appear, I'm sure it is September.
How would you explain how the Chinese setting encouraged the incredible diversity of philosophical thought for such a long time? I mean, it's not unbroken, obviously.
Diversity of thought?
Yeah, 100 schools.
Well, they're all there, but the primary strand which runs through all of them is the Confucian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of these things are on the margin, which, well, the basic paradigm is if you're a successful office holder in a bureaucracy, you're a Confucian, and if you're not, and you live privately, you're a Taoist, or maybe a Buddhist of some kind. And so the diversity is preserved that way. For instance, the Tangdang Long Way, I mean, he was a serious Buddhist, but he also was a successful administrator in the civil bureaucracy in the central government. And he seemed to switch quite easily, between the two, compartmentalize these things. And the ability of Chinese intellectuals in traditional times to accommodate different strands of thought, it depends on circumstances. If the circumstances demand one particular mindset, it's adopted for that particular reason. And if the situation changes, you change accordingly. I think that's how it was preserved. And of course, the written word is preserved. I mean, the library here is immense, but it is tiny compared to what's really out there in Chinese text. Now I have probably 5 or 6 times as much on PDF files that I carry around with me on one little external drive. This is quite something. You don't have to be at Harvard or Princeton, Stanford anymore to work. You can carry it around in your pocket. It's just amazing.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming.